Good morning. My name is Mark Hewitt. I'm Potter from down in North Carolina, and I'm delighted introducing Lewis Katz to you, who I first met at a wood firing conference many years ago, and he had a black t-shirt on with a picture of his lookalike, Sigmund Freud, and it was in pink, and so the little slogan underneath the picture was Pink Freud. So Lewis will entertain you all, not only with his humor, but also with his intelligence. In reading his resume, it became clear that if you have a father who's a harpsichord-making pharmacist and a politically active school-teaching mother, you're likely to end up making an organ that spews fire, and go to Thailand to learn how traditional potters make their pots, and learn fluent Thai, and produce a series of videos that are very funny and very perceptive, and I encourage you to follow what he does and listen carefully to this lecture, and I know we're in for a treat. So, here's Lewis.
Good morning. Thanks for coming. Oh, wow. Cool. It's there. I decided I was going to thank my teachers, seeing that this is NCECA. My parents, music teachers at where I grew up, they were just phenomenal. My first ceramics teacher is a guy named, you see that? Even I get nervous. Do you hear that in my voice? And I know exactly what to do about it. Joe Polinsky, Georgette Zerbies, John Stevenson, Kurt Weiser, Walter Spinks, an art historian, Ken Ferguson, Viktor Babu, George Timmock, Mike Pede, and Rick Pope. I can clearly say without these people I wouldn't be here. I'm indebted to them. And I also want to make sure that we thank especially at the beginning of the conference here, the NCECA office staff, the crew, the AV crew in the back, the unsung heroes, the officers of NCECA who work, some of them tirelessly all year long for things like this, volunteers, friends, colleagues, and I wouldn't be here without you, players. This talk, you guys can see the slides there, right? Cool. Okay, the work in the back is my wife's work, Gail Bush. This talk is about form, but if I had to rename it, I'd just call it volume. But we're going to cut form up into a bunch of pieces. Anytime we use words, we cut reality into pieces with the words. Words don't have mass. You can't grab them. You can't do anything. They're ghosts. But we believe in them. So I'm going to cut up reality into a bunch of pieces. This is one way to cut up form. You can think of form that's mainly compressive form, tensile form. This is the engineering standpoint. That's where I started. Maybe shear form. I couldn't think of any of those, but it sounded good. You can do it like we do in the university and cut things up into materials and processes. It's really convenient if you have to build labs. We have the clay lab. You know, there's people that work with clay. There's people that work with fibers. There's the metal studio and sculpture. They seem to want to garner everything. I say that what they're just doing with metals is using reduced ceramics. But there's the wood lab. And there's, of course, painting. Usually there's a painting studio. Some people do it in ceramics. That's cool. There's printmaking. This is Wedgwood. There's something called time-based media. I dabble in that. Video, photography. We all do a little bit of photography. Photography is part of clay. Don't let them make a separate lab. Put it in the ceramic studio. There's another way to cut the pie. And there's an infinite number of ways to cut any pie. Anything you want to cut up into little pieces, you can find lots of ways. Use or function cuts. That first one should say narration, not illustration. Then there's physical tools. This guy over here that introduced me makes pots. Those are physical tools. So are hammers, kilns, cars, the building we're in. They're all tools. We're standing in a huge piece of art. Whether you like it or not, it is. And you're sitting on pieces of art. They're all physical tools. Maybe you disagree with me. That's okay. There's expression, investigation. Everything is investigation. When you're working on something, you're always investigating something. And there's humor. And We all work with all of that sometimes. But this talk is about one of three slices. They're not particularly good slices, but they're the ones I've been thinking about for a very long time. There's all sorts of stuff left out: volumetric, mass-based, and anatomically structured. Okay, anatomically structured. These are things that are structured. They have bones, they have muscle, and they have skin. And if you think back to the first way I cut things up, there was compressive strength, tensile strength. And the bones are under compression from the tension of the muscles and the tendons. And the tendons are under tension because of the compressive strength of the bones. There's a dynamic tension in things that are sculpted this way. And dynamic tension is something that all pot makers and most sculptors are looking for, just in a different way. There's mass-based sculpture. Mass-based sculpture also has a dynamic tension. I'm talking about things that look like they're solid. They tend to have strong horizontal and vertical elements. The reason is gravity. Gravity defines everything that we do on the planet, with a strong vertical line and its opposition a horizontal line. And in them, the dynamic tension is the compressive strength of the material and gravity. Those are the two things that work against each other. There aren't that many of them, but it's a nice cut, at least for this talk. What I'm going to talk about is what I call volumetric form. And maybe I use the word a little bit different than everybody else. Okay, live with it. This is the pigeonhole we reside in, mostly in ceramics. The reason is two reasons. There's a dynamic tension. Things that are made really thick tend to blow up, and things made out of clay with thin walls tend to be containers. And that blowing up and containment, there's all sorts of stuff happening in there. But it's not just clay that has this. This is Henry Moore. He's got no bones. There are no bones in his work. It's like someone took a figure and took the skin off and puffed air into it and stretched in a couple of places. There's nothing in there. Even when he sculpts bones, there are no bones in it. If you made this out of white vinyl and got a compressor, you could blow it up. It would look the same way. If you're going to tell me there's bones in there, you're going to have to show me where they are, because I don't see them. Greg Reuter, my colleague at Texas A&M Corpus Christi, works in two media. I replaced his ceramic half. He was doing sculpture and ceramics. And I watched him work in the two studios. And the work that he made in one studio and the work that he made in the other studio was different. Even if it was the same subject matter, it was different. Even if it was solid, if he started in the ceramic studio, it tended to be about volume. And if he made it in the sculpture studio, it tended to have mass. It tended to look solid. And, his work wasn't great examples of it, but I looked in his studio where he was working every day. I've been looking at his work for 23 years. And things become apparent. This woman, Hylian, she deserves the gold medal. I don't know what we should do for her, but we should do something. That book, A Potter's Hand Workbook, it's stupendous. You don't need to read it. You need to look at the pictures. And then you need to read it. And then you need to look at the pictures again. She works with what I call quiet form. They grow on you. And if you don't own that, I don't care what field you're in, you should get that book. It's cheap. Buy it used. Wait for the price to come down. We'll talk more about her in a minute. Birdy. Birdy started as a ceramic artist. There's a bunch of these people. They made pots, and then they moved to sculpture. And there was always this quality of their sculpture. It looked like it had a puff of air put in it. Just blown up a little bit, like there was an active tension between the surface and the volume it contains. And Hylian talks about that, but she never uses the word breath. I've heard a couple of people using that word since that book came out, and I think it's an important word. Breath, I'm defining it, is the active tension between the surface of an object and the volume it contains. And I'm going to talk about that more and more. I was thinking a lot about it when this guy came to town at the Island University where I teach, Texas A&M Corpus Christi. There's my plug. And his forms are complex. There's this idea that this active tension, people talk about it in a lot of different ways, but that things have to be inflated. But it's really a sense that the volume inside and the surface of the pot, and I'm not talking about the wall, but the absolute surface, are interacting. That there's an interaction between them, that one is forming the other. And so I call that active tension. And it doesn't have to all be convex form. It can be concave form. There are a lot of examples of it. I'm thinking about Mark's tumblers right now. They got this nice waist in them, and they come out. Every time I look at them, especially the last couple of months when I knew I was coming here, I thought of 3 Mile Island, not too far from here, in those cooling towers. Every time I see those, I think pots. They can also have a sort of sense of suction. But I look a lot at what might be called Mingay, real Mingay in Thailand and other places. I'm really drawn to utilitarian pots. And people that make pots for strict utility have just convex forms. They never have a concavity. They never have a little curve at the bottom. They're trying to maximize volume, as little work as possible, as little clay as possible, as little kiln space as possible. And they tend to make things that move towards spheres. These are 2 pots from Thailand that I bought in 1988 for 60 cents a piece. I overpaid. Really, that was just the deposit on them. Those were deposit bottles. This is David Shaner, who we all miss. And if you don't miss him, you miss him anyways. He was a great man. If you look at the bottom of this pot, you'll see that there's a small concavity in the bottom. And what that does to the form, it always gives your forms just a little sense of lift. It just pulls them off. It makes them defy gravity. And defiance is really good. I defy a lot of things. But anyways, it makes them work. It makes them pull off the floor. It gives them a sort of dynamic tension. They should be settling down, and they're picking up. It's really great. And I've decided that it's a non-utilitarian thing unless you call beauty utility, in which case it's utilitarian. But I've given it a name. It's called the imperial curve. Any pot that's made for a king anywhere has that in there because they don't care about volume. They can have 6 pots. And so you see it in a lot of places. You see it in old Chinese pots. It can be really subtle, and it still does the same thing. It lifts the pot up. It moves the mass from the ground up into the shoulders. Makes it look like Viktor Babu, who had these huge shoulders. And the pots on the other side there are from Thailand, about 1991. And I got a close-up. Mind you, I believe you can see it from the big slides because you're all trained, but that just little, oh, it's great. It really makes me go. Viktor Babu. So I went to school in Kansas City. We honored Viktor Babu last year, and all the time that he was getting that honor, I kept thinking about how he talked. He had one word that he would talk about form. He'd say blossoming, and then he'd do this dance. It didn't matter what it was, there was always a dance about it. It was really wonderful. And when I was in school, I thought he needs more words. So I went looking. We were playing Scrabble, and I started leafing through the dictionary. You're not supposed to do that. And I find this word years before Harry Potter, erumpent. Erumpent is filled, ready to burst. Well, that's just 1 point. And so I've come up with a scale of erumpancy. Okay? And I decided that it was an important enough concept that we needed to formalize it a little bit. Here's the cat scale of erumpancy, the K scale. There's K0. K0 is stasis. There's nothing happening. You may as well forget about it. Unless you want to make pots that are specifically boring, then don't bother with it. At K1, there's this, I'm confused. Back. K0. I'm looking at the wrong side of my screen. No tension. K1, it's a start. There's a visible swelling, a desire. K1 is a start to spark. Then there's a visible swelling, a desire. K2, you can tell I'm nervous. K3, a growing bulge. It's not ignorable. You know it's there, but it's not beginning to get to, on 3 Mile Island terms, get to be overwhelming. There's no nothing going on there. K4 is the swell is the defining feature. You can say, oh, it's starting to bow out there. You know that it's there. There's no ignoring it, but you don't believe that it's going to burst. There's no sense of criticality. Those are the quiet pots. Clary's pots are always in the quiet side of that. The active forms all happen after K5. K5, there's an undeniable sense that there's pressure and containment. You can't miss it. But it doesn't look like it's going to pop. That's K55. That's where you want to protect yourself because it's going to explode. And we have potters that work there, right where you just, how do they do that, you know? And then there's K6, the pressure's overcome and gravity is starting to take over. K7, pressure is coming out. Gravity has taken over pressure. K8, collapse. K9, flaccidity. K10 is really, it's got a 0 in it. It's just K0 again. It's a circular scale. So I went looking for examples. Here we got a K7 example. This is from my video on Thai pottery. They had a contest and they wanted to check to see how much volume the pots would hold. So they dumped water into their wet pots till they burst. And this is just as the water's coming out. That's my first roll of videotape in 1988. There's an unbelievable number of times where I say, wow, and had to cover it over. So I went looking for people that work about the state of collapse, and Stephen Lee came up. This is K8.2, and I defined it. I can tell you what number it is. So K8.2, this is gravity is taking over. There's almost no sense of pressure left in there, but that doesn't happen till it's flaccid. There's still a little pressure holding it up, but gravity has taken over. It's really moving it down. Gravity is the dominant force. So let me just talk about, this sense that the surface is acting on the volume inside. Give me a break. I started as an engineer. That's just standing there. It just looks like that. You're fooling yourselves. But those kinds of illusions, those kinds of things that aren't really true, but we believe in them, are the things that make life worth living. The things that we can pin down that are really happening, yeah, forget it. So, I've been thinking about this for a long time. In school, they told us you have to imagine yourself inside the pots. And, I grew up a scientist. It's like, come on, give me a break. I'm such a good skeptic. But I built these inflatable teapots. They were sort of a scheme to get all my students to NCECA. We put the audience inside it. And it wasn't until I got inside the teapots that I recognized that maybe they had something there. It was really interesting to be inside them. But we are not all volumetric. And more as we get these programmable kilns that can heat slowly. I've now fired something 9 inches thick out of my class clay without it blowing up or cracking. Who would have figured? There's nothing 3 degrees an hour won't fire, especially if you put in a 2-day hold at the beginning to make sure it doesn't blow up. So this is a brick holding down a tarp, my monument to bricks. I kind of like bricks. I know we got a lot of potters here that play with the humble potter. They work in the country. They got a beat up old barn. All of this stuff, to look the part. But for me, the brick is the ultimate utilitarian functional object. It's made by people that really are humble. They don't recognize that they're artists. They work for an hourly wage. They go home, they smoke cigarettes, all of that stuff. And so I'm always making monuments to them, painting pictures about them. Mostly I paint pictures to tick off painters. It works really well. But I see the brick as the icon for the real. We still have Mingay bricks here. They don't even know they're artists. So this story goes way back to my first art history test. Identify the heads of 2,000 Buddha images by period. This is a Gandharan Buddha image. and this is Walter Spinks at the University of Michigan. They were naturalistic. They were working. They wanted things to look naturalistic. You can see there's just the tiniest little bulge in the corner of his shoulders. That was my first identification. If it had that bulge, it had to be Gupta period. Gandharan period. No bulge, it was Gupta. If it had the bulge, Gandharan. You can sense that there's bones underneath the robe and the muscles. There's a real figure in there. It's really got muscles. And if you look at the cloth, it's rendered just like Greek. And there's a reason for this rendering just like Greek statues. The reason is they had a lot of trade between them. They polished the marble the same way. It's really incredible. But immediately after that, all of that bone and muscle disappeared, and this looks like it's a skin that's been puffed up with a breath of air. This is volumetric. Volumetric sculpture, figurative sculpture in South and Southeast Asia held sway until modern times. And, it's remarkably different. He said it's just more stylized, and I didn't get this breath thing until recently. But there they are side by side. And hopefully you can see the difference. I tested it on my students. They said they could, but they'll say anything. This is out of focus. I took this a couple of years ago in Thailand. I wanted a picture of that shoulder. There's no sense of bone in there. You can kind of imagine it there if you really want to, but it's just volume. So as I was looking at these things, I had to, why are they volumetric? What does this do for them? Buddha images, they're trying to show a state of relaxation, no tension, no sense that this person has any stress. And there's nothing like a soft volumetric form to do that. And in Thailand, they got so soft that there's no bones in that hand. It's like Harry Potter again, lost all its bones. There's no tension in there, and that's what they're trying to show. This is about 1750. In 1988, I was in Thailand. 1989, I went to Thonburi, Thailand, to a bronze casting factory, and I saw them sculpting these strange Buddhas out of plaster. They didn't look quite right. Everything else in Thailand, it looked like the figures from Thailand I was accustomed to. And so I asked this guy what he was doing. My Thai was terrible. And he told me that he was sculpting the inside. And I finally figured it out. It's the core. This is the core to a bronze casting. They're going to put wax over this, plaster over the wax, melt it out, and replace it with bronze, lost wax casting. And he's carving the core. And he was working so hard at such small details. I thought this guy must have a real intimate understanding of this form. And I was talking to the shop owner's son, who fortunately spoke a little bit of English, and we were able to communicate between the two languages. And he uncovered this one in the front, which is covered in wax. So if you look at the shoulder of these two, these are screen captures from my video. Sorry. If you look at the shoulder in the front and you look at the shoulder in the back and just that little crease, you can probably see the difference. One's the core to the inside, the other's covered with a 1/2 inch of wax. It was a spectacular place to visit. If you were paying taxes back in 1988, thank you. So this happened in Thailand until this guy came there. And this is, I'm looking at the time there. This is Ajahn Sin Pirasi. Wow, I've run 32 minutes? Yeah, I'm going. He was brought to Thailand to sculpt figurative sculptures that were naturalistic. They couldn't ship things back and forth. He made a lot of things that looked like Europe. He made a lot of sculptures of kings. Over time, his sculptures became more volumetric. Thai sculptures became more structure-based with muscles, bones, and mass. They affected each other. And there's these strange mixes. This sculpture at the Democracy Monument has got faces that are naturalistic with bones, but all their clothing is puffed out like it's blown up with a blower. Oh, here we go. So, this is my wife's work. She makes things that are flat, sort of. They're about 1/3 as deep as they are wide. It's in Sika and Syracuse on the left-hand side. And she plays with this volume. The way she draws those lines, she's always fiddling with the volume and thinking about the volume she is trying to create with the lines. So I want to go back and just cover some vocabulary: volumetric form, structural form with bones and muscles, and mass, breadth, erumpancy, and the imperial curve. I hope you enjoyed this. I think I'm at time here. Is that true? I've got 5 minutes. Great. So there's a microphone somewhere. Here it comes. If you have questions, feel free to ask. I would understand if there aren't any questions. Go back to the mic and get it. It's on a stand. Thank you for listening to me babble today.
This is not a question, it's a recommendation. His video, Folk Potteries of Thailand, rocks.
Yeah, if you want a copy of it on DVD, email me. I don't know how to stream it online or anything. This was the hardest one to put together I've ever done.
Now, Louis, I have heard it expressed repeatedly that figural sculpture in clay suffers from a hollow working process, and that people who do sculptural ceramics of the figure working in the Beaux-Arts method, solid over an armature, implicitly have an advantage in achieving that structural property you're talking about as opposed to volume. Do you think that the working method skews the mindset, which in turn affects the outcome?
You will never hear me say something against volumetric form.
Oh, not saying against, but
Yeah, I
does
know.
it skew?
You know, if I was going to try and make something that looked like it had bones and muscles, I would work over an armature. I think that that's a reasonable generalization, but I don't think that there's an inherent disadvantage to hollowness. I'm all for hollowness. If you've ever replaced the relays in a Scott electric kiln twice during one firing, you'll know what I'm talking about. But you know, it's one of the. I mean, Henry Moore didn't suffer from hollowness. You know, the fact that his stuff looks hollow is what makes it go. There are a lot of people in sculpture working that way. There's just more people that work with structure. Are we all set here? If you got more questions, we got one right there.
I'm curious, I haven't seen it before, but after Ferguson and Shaner, you had the Z and L. What does that signify?
That's I'm trying not to piss off my brother. I showed it to him. He doesn't want me to talk about people that are deceased without saying of blessed memory. And in this case, they really are. Every one of those images I put up, I'm grateful to having had the experience of meeting those people. Okay, I gotta go. They just gave me